Most disturbing were Eleanor's observations regarding what she called preservation potential. Her assessment of how easily a child could be isolated and manipulated without attracting unwanted attention. Children with numerous family connections, or those who had established relationships with influential community members, were deliberately avoided, regardless of how otherwise suitable they might have appeared to Eleanor's discerning eye. Thomas Henderson's role in the operation focused primarily on maintaining their social facade and managing the practical aspects of their scheme. His charm and apparent sincerity made him effective at cultivating relationships with Richmond's elite, while his business acumen enabled him to create convincing documentation and financial arrangements that would withstand casual scrutiny. He was particularly skilled at identifying potential obstacles to their plans and developing strategies to neutralize them before they became problematic. The physical transformation of the Henderson estate reflected the dual nature of their operation. The main house and formal gardens remained immaculately maintained and were regularly open for charity events and social gatherings. However, the rear portion of the property, including several outbuildings and a section of the basement beneath the main house, was carefully isolated from public view through strategic landscaping and construction projects described to visitors as improvements to our facilities for the children. It was in these hidden areas that the 19 children who passed through the Henderson estate spent their final days. Eleanor's journals described in clinical detail the processes she employed, which she characterized as the perfect preservation of innocence through transcendence. The exact fate of each child was documented with disturbing precision, including observations about their individual responses to what Eleanor called the preparation and the final transition. The community's first indications that something might be amiss at the Henderson estate came in early 1851, when Reverend James Mitchell of the First Presbyterian Church began noticing inconsistencies in the Hendersons' accounts of children who had supposedly been placed with families. As a respected community leader who had occasionally referred orphan children to the Hendersons' care, Mitchell had maintained casual interest in their subsequent placement, occasionally inquiring about their welfare during social events. During one such conversation at a charity auction in February 1851, Thomas Henderson provided information about a child's placement that contradicted what he had told Mitchell several months earlier. While the discrepancy was minor, involving the occupation of the adoptive father, it aroused the minister's curiosity sufficiently to prompt him to make further inquiries. When he attempted to correspond with several families who had supposedly adopted children through the Hendersons, his letters were returned as undeliverable. Mitchell's concerns might have remained private had he not encountered Sarah Sullivan at a church function in March 1851. During their conversation, Sarah mentioned that she had never received any further communication from her daughter Mary since the initial letter informing her of the girl's placement. When Mitchell inquired about the family who had adopted Mary, Sarah's description of what she had been told was inconsistent with the information the Hendersons had provided to the minister about the same family. These discrepancies prompted Mitchell to begin a quiet investigation, reaching out to other families whose children had been placed through the Hendersons. What he discovered was a pattern of inconsistent information, unverifiable placements, and a disturbing lack of ongoing contact between the children and their original families. More troubling was his realization that no one in his extensive network of religious and charitable connections throughout Virginia and neighboring states had ever actually met any of the families who had supposedly adopted children from the Henderson estate. Mitchell's investigation might have proceeded more quickly had he taken his concerns directly to local authorities. However, the Hendersons' standing in the community and their close relationships with influential citizens, including several local officials, made him hesitant to make accusations without irrefutable evidence. Instead, he continued gathering information discreetly, documenting inconsistencies, and attempting to locate any of the children who had passed through the Hendersons' care. The breakthrough in Mitchell's investigation came from an unexpected source. In April 1851, a new maid employed at the Henderson estate discovered a locked room in the basement while carrying out her assigned duties. When she mentioned this discovery to Eleanor, she was immediately dismissed from service with a warning never to speak about anything she had observed in the house. The young woman, Catherine Walsh, was sufficiently disturbed by the encounter to seek counsel from her parish priest, who in turn brought her concerns to Reverend Mitchell. Catherine's description of the locked room, combined with her observations about unusual sounds she had heard from behind the door, and Eleanor's extreme reaction to her discovery, provided Mitchell with sufficient cause for serious concern. After consulting with a small group of trusted colleagues, including a local physician and a magistrate who was not closely connected to the Hendersons, Mitchell made the decision to approach the county sheriff with his suspicions. Sheriff William Blackwood was initially skeptical of Mitchell's concerns. The Hendersons' reputation for philanthropy and their standing in Richmond society made allegations against them difficult to credit without substantial evidence. However, the detailed nature of Mitchell's documentation, combined with the sheriff's own unacknowledged concerns about certain aspects of the Hendersons' operation, convinced him to conduct a discreet preliminary investigation before approaching the couple directly. This investigation revealed additional troubling elements. A review of county records showed no official documentation of any of the supposed adoptions arranged by the Hendersons, despite Thomas's claims that all placements had been properly registered. Inquiries to authorities in neighboring counties, where children had allegedly been placed, yielded similar results. No records existed of the adoptions, and in several cases, the families named in the Hendersons' documentation did not exist at the addresses provided. Most disturbing of all was Blackwood's discovery that Thomas and Eleanor Henderson themselves had no verifiable history prior to their arrival in Richmond in 1846. Correspondence with authorities in Massachusetts revealed no record of a textile manufacturer matching Thomas Henderson's description, while inquiries about Eleanor's family connections yielded equally blank results. The couple had apparently constructed their identities from whole cloth, a realization that transformed Blackwood's skepticism into serious concern. On May 10, 1851, Sheriff Blackwood assembled a small group of deputies and, accompanied by Reverend Mitchell and Dr. Samuel Harrow, the physician who had joined Mitchell's initial investigation, approached the Henderson estate with a warrant to search the property. The timing of their arrival was deliberately chosen to coincide with a period when the Hendersons were expected to be attending a social function in Richmond, allowing the search to begin without immediate confrontation. The initial search of the main house revealed nothing unusual beyond the expected elegance of a wealthy family's residence. However, when the group proceeded to the basement, they discovered that the door Catherine Walsh had described had been concealed behind a recently constructed false wall, the plaster still not fully dried. When this barrier was removed, they found a heavy oak door secured with multiple locks, the key to which was not immediately discoverable on the property. The forced entry into this hidden room revealed a scene that would haunt everyone present for the remainder of their lives. The chamber had been furnished as what Eleanor's journals would later describe as the preservation room, a space designed specifically for the final stage of what she considered her artistic process. The walls were lined with specially constructed cabinets, each containing small compartments sealed with glass fronts. Behind these glass panels were what initially appeared to be dolls, but were in fact the preserved remains of children, each carefully positioned and dressed as though in peaceful repose. The search party's horrified examination of this macabre display was interrupted by the unexpected return of Thomas and Eleanor Henderson, who had apparently been alerted to the presence of law enforcement at their estate. Their reaction to the discovery revealed the full extent of their detachment from normal human empathy. Rather than expressing shock, denial, or attempting to flee, Eleanor appeared almost relieved at what she called her collection had finally been discovered. Thomas, more pragmatic in his response, immediately attempted to negotiate terms of surrender that would protect what he referred to as my wife's artistic legacy. Sheriff Blackwood's arrest of the Hendersons was conducted with remarkable restraint given the horror of what had been discovered. The Henderson family mystery, simplified version. In the fall of 1851, a man working at a church cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, made a scary discovery. While digging up an old oak tree, he found a small wooden box buried beneath the roots. Inside were 19 tiny handmade dolls. Each doll had a child's name carved into the bottom. What made this discovery truly frightening was that every doll had been broken in different ways. Some had arms or legs torn off. Others had their faces scratched away. This discovery led police to uncover the most organized case of missing children that Virginia had ever seen. All the cases were connected to one family, the Hendersons. They appeared to be good people who helped children, but they were hiding a terrible secret. Before we continue, let us know where you're listening from. If this story interests you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow, we have something extra special for you. What made this discovery so frightening wasn't just the dolls. When police checked the names on the dolls, they matched missing children reports from 3 counties. Between 1847 and 1851, 19 children had disappeared without a trace. All had vanished within 20 miles of Richmond. And all were somehow connected to the Henderson family estate. The woman of the house, Eleanor Henderson, had kept detailed journals. She called what she was doing her collection. These records wouldn't be found until 1893, over 40 years. Later, when workers tore down the family home, local people who had attended the Henderson charity events for orphaned children would only whisper about what happened during those years. They called the estate the Weeping Grounds. What you're about to hear is the true story behind those 19 missing children. It began with what seemed like charity work in a wealthy southern town. It ended with the most organized series of child disappearances in Virginia's history. Before we continue with the Henderson family story, this channel isn't for everyone. It's only for brave souls who want to uncover mysteries that others are afraid to tell. If you're one of those rare people who seeks the truth behind America's darkest secrets, hit that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We're building a community of true mystery seekers. Your story might be next. Now, let's discover what really happened in the fancy rooms and hidden chambers of the Henderson estate between 1847 and 1851. The Hendersons arrive when Thomas Jefferson Henderson and his wife, Eleanor, arrived in Richmond. In spring 1846, they seemed like the perfect Southern couple. Thomas was 55 years old, with silver hair and perfect manners. He claimed he had made his money in textile manufacturing in Massachusetts. He said they moved to Virginia because of his wife's poor health. Eleanor was 20 years younger than her husband. She was known for her graceful appearance, quiet manner, and love of helping children in need. The Hendersons quickly became popular in Richmond society. They bought one of the largest estates outside the city. It had a beautiful mansion, large gardens, and several smaller buildings. Thomas said these buildings would be used for their charity work. Their wealth and good manners opened doors throughout Richmond's elite circles. Their desire to help poor children made community leaders and church authorities like them even more. Within months of arriving, the Hendersons started what they called the Children's Haven. This was supposed to be a charity foundation dedicated to helping orphaned and poor children throughout the region. Eleanor became known for taking in children who had been abandoned or whose parents could no longer care for them. She offered what she called temporary sanctuary until permanent homes could be found with suitable families. Their reputation for charity work was boosted by elaborate charity events held at their estate. Richmond's wealthiest citizens would gather to donate money for the placement and education of unfortunate children. These events featured tours of the well-maintained parts of the estate. There were performances by children who had supposedly been helped by the Hendersons. Eleanor would make emotional speeches about the problems facing Virginia's most vulnerable young citizens. The truth about the Hendersons. What few people knew at the time was that Thomas Jefferson Henderson was not who he claimed to be. His real name was Theodore Jensen. He had fled Philadelphia in 1845 after being accused of financial crimes and strange behavior toward children at an orphanage where he worked as a board member. These accusations never led to formal charges, but they damaged his reputation enough that he needed a fresh start in the community where his past was unknown. Eleanor Henderson's background was also fake. She was born Elizabeth Nichols in a small Connecticut town. She had worked as a nurse in several institutions for children before meeting Theodore Jensen in 1844. Their courtship was brief and mostly conducted through letters. In these letters, they discovered their shared interest in what Eleanor's private journals would later describe as the collection and preservation of innocence. The change from Theodore Jensen and Elizabeth Nichols to Thomas and Eleanor Henderson was more than just new names. It was a calculated decision to create new identities that would give them access to vulnerable children without raising suspicion. Their careful building of social connections in Richmond was not designed to help with charity work. It was designed to establish credibility that would protect them from suspicion as children began to disappear. The first disappearance, the first child to vanish, was 8-year-old Mary Sullivan. She was the daughter of a widowed seamstress who had been struggling to provide for her family after her husband died from tuberculosis. Mary was offered a place at the Henderson estate in July 1847. This was supposedly so she could receive education alongside other children while her mother looked for work. When Sarah Sullivan visited the estate 2 weeks later, she was told that Mary had been placed with a respectable family in Petersburg. This family had supposedly made a large donation to the Children's Haven in exchange for the opportunity to raise such a promising girl. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The documents shown to Sarah Sullivan looked real, complete with official stamps and signatures. The large payment she received was described as your daughter's settlement. This helped ease any doubts she might have had, especially when it came with a letter supposedly written by Mary, describing her happiness in her new home. Sarah's limited ability to read made it difficult for her to verify if the letter was real. Her desperate financial situation made the payment too important to question. This pattern would be repeated 18 more times over the next 4 years. Children from poor families, usually those with single parents or relatives serving as guardians, would be offered temporary placement at the Henderson estate. After a period ranging from 2 weeks to 3 months, the families would be told that the children had been placed with wealthy families seeking heirs or companions for their own children. In each case, documentation was provided, along with enough money to discourage further questions. How the scheme worked. What made the Hendersons' plan particularly effective was their careful selection of victims. They deliberately sought children from families with limited resources, education, and social connections. These were people who would be unlikely or unable to verify their claims or challenge their authority. In most cases, the families were led to believe that their children had been given opportunities far beyond what they could provide themselves. This made their disappearance seem like a blessing rather than a tragedy. The children who entered the Henderson estate came from different backgrounds. Some were true orphans whose distant relatives or community guardians were easily convinced that placement through the Hendersons represented their best hope for a secure future. Others came from families experiencing temporary hardship who believed the arrangement would be short-term. A few were even sent by local churches and charitable organizations who had been completely deceived by the Hendersons' carefully constructed reputation for good works. Eleanor Henderson's journals discovered decades later, revealed the calculated nature of their operation. Each child was selected according to specific criteria outlined in her careful notes. Physical appearance was most important. The Hendersons sought children with exceptional features and expressive eyes. Temperament was equally important, with preference given to those who showed what Eleanor described as suitable responsiveness to attention and appropriate fear of authority. The couple was taken into custody without violence, though several deputies later reported that it required extraordinary self-control not to respond more forcefully to Eleanor's continued references to the children as her preserved innocence and her apparent pride in what she had accomplished. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the Henderson family story intensifies. If this tale is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. The truth behind those 19 missing children is more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. Let's discover together what happens when a community uncovers the darkest secret hiding behind a facade of charity and goodwill. The investigation that followed the arrest of Thomas and Eleanor Henderson revealed layers of deception and horror that extended far beyond the initial discovery in the basement room. The careful documentation kept by Eleanor, journals, sketches, and meticulously labeled specimen records provided investigators with disturbing insights into the couple's methodical approach to child abduction and murder. What had appeared to be a charitable operation was revealed as an elaborate facade designed specifically to provide the Hendersons with access to vulnerable children while shielding them from suspicion. Eleanor's journals, written in elegant script and bound in fine leather, documented each child's arrival at the estate, the specific qualities that had drawn her attention, and the process she referred to as preservation. The clinical detachment with which she described her actions suggested a mind entirely divorced from normal human empathy, viewing children not as living beings but as specimens to be collected and displayed. Most disturbing were her detailed observations of each child's final moments, which she described as the transcendent culmination of her work. Thomas Henderson's own documentation, discovered in a hidden compartment in his study, revealed the financial aspects of their operation. Ledgers showed that the money supposedly dedicated to charitable work had instead funded the construction of Eleanor's preservation room and the specialized equipment it contained. Additional records confirmed that the payments made to families were calculated precisely to discourage further inquiry, substantial enough to address immediate needs, but insufficient to provide long-term security that might have freed them to ask more questions about their children's welfare. Dr. Samuel Harrow, the physician who had accompanied Sheriff Blackwood during the initial search, was tasked with examining the remains of the 19 children. His medical report, sealed by court order until 1897, contained observations that would later inform modern understanding of pathological psychology. Harrow noted that the children had been subjected to a process combining elements of primitive embalming and taxidermy, with Eleanor apparently refining her techniques over time. The earliest victims showed signs of crude preservation methods, while the more recent ones reflected increasingly sophisticated approaches. The impact of these discoveries on the Richmond community was immediate and devastating. Families who had entrusted their children to the Hendersons' care were confronted with the unimaginable truth that their children had never been placed with loving families, but had instead fallen victim to Eleanor's twisted obsession. For many, the realization that they had accepted money in exchange for their children, however innocently, added a layer of guilt to their grief that would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. Sarah Sullivan, mother of Mary, the first child to disappear, collapsed upon being informed of her daughter's fate and never fully recovered. She spent her remaining years in a state of profound melancholy, eventually taking her own life on what would have been Mary's 16th birthday. Other families responded with anger rather than despair, demanding justice for their children and questioning how such atrocities could have occurred within a community that prided itself on Christian charity and social responsibility. The investigation extended beyond Richmond, as authorities attempted to trace the Hendersons' movements prior to their arrival in Virginia. Correspondence with law enforcement agencies throughout the Northeast revealed a pattern of suspicious activities associated with various identities the couple had assumed over the preceding decade. In Philadelphia, Theodore Jensen had indeed served on the board of an orphanage, leaving shortly after several children had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. In Boston, a woman matching Eleanor's description had worked briefly as a nurse in a children's hospital where unusual patient deaths had been noted, but never fully investigated. The most significant historical discovery came from Hartford, Connecticut, where Elizabeth Nichols, now known to be Eleanor Henderson, had been employed at a school for girls. Between 1840 and 1842, records indicated that she had been dismissed, following concerns about her unusual attachment to certain students and the discovery of disturbing drawings in her personal quarters. The school administrators had not reported these concerns to authorities, preferring to handle the matter discreetly to avoid scandal, a decision that had inadvertently allowed Elizabeth to continue her activities elsewhere. As investigators pieced together the Hendersons' history, a picture emerged of two individuals whose psychological abnormalities had found perfect complement in each other. Thomas appeared to be primarily motivated by the power and control their operation afforded him, while Eleanor was driven by an obsession she characterized in her journals as preserving perfect innocence at its peak. Together, they had created a system that allowed them to indulge these impulses while maintaining a respectable public facade. The legal proceedings against the Hendersons were unprecedented in Virginia's judicial history. The nature and extent of their crimes presented challenges that existing legal frameworks were ill-equipped to address. Questions arose regarding Eleanor's mental capacity to stand trial, as her continued references to her collection and apparent pride in her work suggested a profound detachment from reality. Thomas, by contrast, demonstrated a clear understanding of his actions and their consequences, focusing his efforts on negotiating terms that might spare him the death penalty. Judge Hiram Winters, assigned to the case in June 1851, faced extraordinary pressure from both the community demanding justice and legal scholars concerned with establishing proper judicial precedent for such unusual circumstances. His decision to have Eleanor examined by medical experts specializing in mental disorders reflected the emerging understanding that certain forms of criminal behavior might stem from psychological abnormalities rather than simple moral failure. The examination of Eleanor Henderson was conducted by Dr. Michael Ashton, a physician who had studied with European experts in the emerging field of psychological medicine. Ashton's evaluation, which extended over several weeks, concluded that Eleanor suffered from what he termed moral insanity, a condition in which intellectual faculties remained intact while moral understanding was profoundly impaired. This diagnosis, controversial among both medical and legal authorities, raised complex questions about criminal responsibility and appropriate punishment. Thomas Henderson's case presented fewer complications. His calculated participation in the crimes, combined with evidence of his efforts to conceal their activities and create false documentation, clearly established both his guilt and his understanding of the wrongful nature of his actions. During questioning, he revealed that their operation had been entirely his wife's conception, but acknowledged that he had facilitated and enabled her activities for both financial gain and the satisfaction of witnessing her artistic process. The trial of Thomas and Eleanor Henderson began on September 8, 1851, drawing unprecedented attention from throughout Virginia and neighboring states. The courthouse in Richmond was modified to accommodate the exceptional number of spectators, including families of victims, community leaders who had been deceived by the Hendersons, and journalists representing publications from as far away as New York and Boston. The proceedings were closed to the public during the presentation of the most disturbing evidence, a decision that generated considerable controversy, but was deemed necessary to maintain public decorum. Prosecutor James Montgomery presented a methodical case that combined physical evidence, documentation from the Hendersons' own records, and testimony from families who had surrendered their children to the couple's care. Montgomery's approach was deliberately measured, avoiding sensationalism in favor of establishing the systematic nature of the crimes and the calculated deception that had enabled them. His presentation portrayed the Hendersons not as supernatural monsters, but as human predators, who had exploited social systems and community trust for their own disturbing purposes. The defense strategy for Thomas Henderson, conducted by attorney William Cartwright, focused primarily on mitigating factors that might spare his client the death penalty. Cartwright argued that Thomas had been unduly influenced by his wife's psychological condition and had participated in the crimes, not out of inherent malice but from misguided devotion. This approach proved ineffective against the overwhelming evidence of Thomas's deliberate participation in both the murders and the elaborate deception that had facilitated them. Eleanor's defense, managed separately by attorney Robert Thornton, relied heavily on Dr. Ashton's diagnosis of moral insanity to argue that she lacked the capacity to understand the wrongful nature of her actions. Thornton presented Eleanor not as a calculating killer, but as a profoundly disturbed woman whose illness had manifested in a form of obsessive collection that tragically involved human subjects. This defense was undermined by Eleanor's own writings, which demonstrated clear awareness that her activities required secrecy and deception, suggesting she understood that society would condemn her actions if discovered. The testimony of Reverend James Mitchell proved particularly damaging to both defendants. Mitchell's account of his gradual discovery of inconsistencies in the Henderson stories, combined with his detailed documentation of his investigation, established that their operation had been deliberately structured to evade detection. His description of the careful way they had cultivated relationships with influential community members, specifically to shield themselves from scrutiny, revealed the calculating nature of their approach. Catherine Walsh, the maid whose discovery of the locked basement room had ultimately led to the Hendersons' exposure, provided emotional testimony regarding her brief employment at the estate. She described hearing what she had initially believed to be a child's cry from behind the locked door, and Eleanor's extreme reaction when questioned about it. Walsh's simple, straightforward account of being immediately dismissed and warned never to speak about what she had seen resonated powerfully with the jury and spectators alike. The most devastating testimony came from Dr. Samuel Harrow, who had examined the remains of the 19 children. Harrow's clinical description of the preservation methods employed by Eleanor, delivered with professional detachment that barely concealed his own horror, left no doubt about the deliberate and methodical nature of the crimes. His expert opinion that the techniques had evolved and improved over time undermined the defense's argument that Eleanor had been in the grip of uncontrollable impulses, suggesting instead a calculated approach to perfecting her art. The jury's deliberation was remarkably brief given the complexity of the case. After just 4 hours of discussion, they returned with guilty verdicts for both Thomas and Eleanor Henderson on all counts. Judge Winters sentenced Thomas to death by hanging, rejecting defense arguments for leniency based on his supposedly secondary role in the crimes. For Eleanor, the judge ordered confinement in the newly established Central Lunatic Asylum for the remainder of her natural life, acknowledging the medical testimony regarding her psychological condition while ensuring she could never again harm children. The execution of Thomas Jefferson Henderson took place on November 12, 1851, witnessed by a carefully limited group that included Sheriff Blackwood, Reverend Mitchell, and representatives of the victims' families. Contemporary accounts describe Thomas as composed and resigned, offering no final statement beyond a brief acknowledgement that justice is being served. His body was buried in an unmarked grave on prison grounds, reflecting the community's desire to leave no monument to his memory. Eleanor Henderson's confinement presented unprecedented challenges for the asylum system. Her continued insistence that her collection represented artistic achievement rather than criminal atrocity made treatment virtually impossible, while her intelligence and manipulative abilities posed ongoing security concerns. She was housed in a specially constructed secure ward, isolated from other patients and under constant supervision. Despite these precautions, she maintained her detailed journals until her death from tuberculosis in 1857, filling pages with sketches of children and plans for preservations she could no longer execute. The aftermath of the Henderson case had profound effects on Richmond society and Virginia's approach to child welfare. The revelation that such horrors could occur within a community that prided itself on Christian charity and social responsibility prompted serious examination of how vulnerable children were protected, or failed to be protected, by existing systems. The ease with which the Hendersons had established their false charitable operation highlighted dangerous gaps in oversight and accountability. In response to these revelations, the Virginia legislature passed what became known as the Child Protection Act of 1852, establishing the first formal system in the state for registering and monitoring organizations providing care for children. The act required regular inspections of facilities, verification of placement records, and criminal penalties for operating unregistered children's homes or orphanages. While primitive by modern standards, these regulations represented a significant advancement in institutional protection for vulnerable children. Reverend James Mitchell, whose persistent investigation had been instrumental in exposing the Hendersons, dedicated the remainder of his ministry to advocating for child welfare reforms. His sermons addressing the community's collective responsibility for protecting children became widely circulated throughout the South, influencing religious leaders to take more active roles in monitoring charitable organizations operating within their communities. Mitchell's practical approach, combining spiritual guidance with specific policy recommendations, provided a model for clergy involvement and social reform that extended well beyond Virginia. Sheriff William Blackwood's career was similarly transformed by his experience with the Henderson case. Recognized for his careful handling of the investigation and arrest, Blackwood was later appointed to a state commission, tasked with developing improved training for law enforcement officers in recognizing and responding to unusual crimes. His insistence that even respected community members should be subject to scrutiny when evidence warranted investigation challenged prevailing assumptions about the relationship between social status and criminal suspicion. Dr. Samuel Harrow's detailed medical observations of the Henderson victims contributed significantly to emerging understanding of forensic medicine. His meticulous documentation of preservation methods and postmortem changes established precedents for medical evidence in criminal proceedings that would influence judicial practice throughout the region. Later in his career, Harrow would compile his experiences into a textbook used in medical education, ensuring that lessons from the Henderson case informed a generation of physicians. For the families of the 19 children, the aftermath of the case brought closure but little comfort. The return of their children's remains for proper burial provided opportunity for appropriate mourning rituals, but the knowledge of what had happened at the Henderson estate left emotional wounds that would never fully heal. Several families relocated from the Richmond area, seeking to escape both painful memories and the stigma that unfortunately attached to those connected to the notorious case. The Henderson estate itself became the subject of intense debate regarding its appropriate disposition. Some community members advocated demolishing the buildings entirely, viewing them as irredeemably tainted by the horrors that had occurred within. Others argued for repurposing the property for beneficial use, suggesting that allowing evil to render the space permanently unusable represented a form of surrender. After considerable deliberation, the local government seized the property for tax delinquency, the Hendersons' assets having been exhausted by legal proceedings, and converted it into a legitimate orphanage operated under strict public oversight. This transformation of the property from a site of horror to a place of genuine care for vulnerable children was led by Sarah Mitchell, Reverend Mitchell's wife, who had been deeply affected by her involvement in supporting the victims' families. Under her direction, the redesigned facility incorporated unprecedented safeguards, including regular independent inspections, detailed record-keeping reviewed by a community oversight board, and open visiting policies that encouraged ongoing family connections. These innovations would later influence standards for childcare institutions throughout Virginia. The story of the Henderson family and their crimes gradually transformed from immediate community trauma to historical cautionary tale. By the 1870s, the case was regularly cited in discussions of child welfare policy, criminal psychology, and the importance of community vigilance. The discovery of Eleanor's complete journals during renovations to the asylum in 1893 renewed interest in the case, particularly among medical researchers studying the development of what would later be termed psychopathic personality disorders. Modern psychological analysis of Eleanor Henderson, based on her extensive writings and the detailed observations of those who examined her, suggests she likely suffered from a combination of disorders characterized by complete absence of empathy, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and delusional beliefs about preserving children. Thomas Henderson, by contrast, appears to represent a more common criminal type, an opportunistic predator who recognized and exploited his wife's psychological abnormalities for personal gain and power. The discovery of the wooden box containing 19 dolls, which had initiated the final phase of the investigation, remained something of a mystery until the publication of Eleanor's complete journals in 1902. Her writings revealed that she had created the dolls as preliminary studies for each child, carefully crafting them to record the specific features that had drawn her attention. The deliberate damage to each doll reflected her plans for the preservation process, while the burial of the box represented what she called consecration of the collection site. The Henderson case continues to resonate with historians and criminologists because it encapsulates so many elements that remain relevant to understanding predatory behavior directed at children. The careful construction of a respectable social facade, the deliberate targeting of victims from vulnerable populations, the exploitation of institutional gaps in protection systems, and the manipulation of community trust all represent patterns that would be recognized in similar cases throughout subsequent decades. What makes the story particularly significant for modern observers is the community response that followed the discovery of the crimes. Rather than simply punishing the perpetrators and attempting to forget the horrors that had occurred in Richmond, society engaged in meaningful self-examination regarding how such predators had been able to operate undetected. The resulting reforms, while imperfect, represented genuine efforts to address systemic vulnerabilities that had enabled the Hendersons' operation. If you're finding this historical account disturbing yet important, make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more hidden stories from America's past. The Henderson family case isn't just a tale of horror. It's a crucial lesson in how communities can fail their most vulnerable members, and how that failure can be addressed through reform and vigilance. In our next segment, we'll explore the investigation in greater detail and the shocking discoveries made when authorities began to piece together the Hendersons' past. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.